For the 1989 Major League Baseball season, the Chicago Cubs, they won the NL East Division. Unfortunately for the Northsiders, the Cubs, they lost to the San Francisco Giants in the National League Championship Series 4-1, denying Chicago their first World Series appearance since 1945. However, going forward, there will be a lot to be excited for, as the Cubs had a nice blend of established talent and youth. So to begin, first with the 1990 Chicago Cubs, the two names that obviously needs to be mentioned are Ryne Sandberg and Andre Dawson. Sandberg, who was still in his prime in 1990 at age 30, was being talked about one of the greatest second basemen ever. He had hit a career-high 40 home runs in 1990, which was the National League leader. Then there's the Hawk, Andre Dawson, who'd be at age 35, but was still a productive middle-of-the-order hitter. But on the younger side, the Cubs, they would have the first baseman for the next decade in fan favorite Mark Grace, who was a major leaguer who had the most hits in the 90s. At shortstop was Shawon Dunston. Now at the time, shortstop was not a position where players were really putting up huge offensive numbers. So with that said, Dunston, he was a decent hitting shortstop in the NL in the late 80s and early 90s, becoming a two-time All-Star. But on defense, Dunston, he was such the opposite of his double play partner in Ryne Sandberg, as Ryne was so fundamentally sound at second base. 9 Golden Glove awards. His fielding made everything seem so effortless. Threw the ball to first with ease. While on the other hand, it was entertaining watching Dunston at short, because every time Dunston fielded the ball, he would really wind up and whip that ball to first, seemingly putting his full effort and strength into every throw, as he had a cannon, as there were times I felt bad for Mark Grace for having to receive some of those wild lasers. Sometimes he would have no idea where the ball would end up. Next to mention is pitcher Greg Maddux, who's 24 years old, starting to become a dominant ace, as he would wind up winning 4 consecutive Cy Young awards. Obviously, more on the professor later on. And the last 2 names I want to mention are outfielders Jerome Walton and Dwight Smith. Walton and Smith, they finished 1-2 in NL Rookie of the Year voting in 1989. They're a big part of Chicago's 1989 division-winning team. The future in the Cubs' outfield seemed to be bright, but Walton and Smith couldn't quite improve on the rookie seasons. The Chicago Cubs, they had a solid 5 to build around with Sandberg, Dawson, Grace, Dunston, and Maddux to continue their success from the 1989 season. But from 1990 to 1992, Chicago's North Side team was never able to get more than 78 wins, as the Pittsburgh Pirates wound up dominating the division during this time frame. Now, some key items I want to mention during this 3-year span. In 1990, Ryne Sandberg hit his 123 consecutive games without an error at second base snapped. That was the record at the time, later broken by Placido Polanco. And for 1991, the Cubs, they signed 3 free agents who were all previously All-Stars in George Bell, who was a 1987 AL MVP. More on him later on. Then starting pitcher Danny Jackson and closer Dave Smith. Jackson and Smith wind up being 2 of the worst free agent signings in Cubs history. So with these signings and with the talent on paper, the Cubs, they got out to an 18-19 start, which led to manager Don Zimmer being fired. But the biggest fireworks from the season came from Andre Dawson, who argued a 3rd strike call, then bumped umpire Joe West, which prompted Dawson to uncharacteristically lose his cool, which resulted in Dawson tossing bats onto the field and the fans littering Wrigley Field with debris. Enter the 1992 season, Jim Lefevre, he'd be the new manager. He led Seattle to the first ever winning season in 1991, and in addition, there would also be a new general manager in Larry Himes. And with Himes, things would get interesting for the Chicago Cubs. So Larry Himes, he was the Chicago Cubs' new general manager. Previously, Himes was the GM of the Chicago White Sox. In short, Himes seemingly did a great job on the South Side, building a talented young core. Now, I understand drafting baseball players is such a collective effort in comparison to other sports, but nonetheless, Larry Himes from 1987 to 1990 really hit on his first-round picks with Jack McDowell, Robin Ventura, Frank Thomas, and Alex Fernandez. But then for some reason, Himes was fired by the White Sox after the 1990 season. So you look at what's happening on the South Side, with the Sox becoming an up-and-coming team, which led to the Chicago Cubs saying, sure, we'll have some of that, as it seemed to be a great hire. While Himes was with the White Sox, he was familiar with an outfielder from the Dominican Republic whom he traded for from Texas. Hence, the first big move Himes made was trading George Bell for Sammy Sosa. Obviously more on Sosa later on, but this has been regarded as one of the most lopsided trades ever, as George Bell's last MLB season was in 1993. But after the 1992 season, 2 major departures would transpire. First, the Cubs, they offered Andre Dawson a 2-year, $7 million contract. Dawson, his agent, wanted more, near $11 million, but the Cubs weren't going to budge, which led to the Hawks signing with the Boston Red Sox for 2 years, $9.3 million. And then there's the big departure of Greg Maddux. So the Cubs ace, he was a free agent after the 1992 season and was the NL Cy Young Award winner. Maddox's agent was Scott Boras, who obviously wanted top dollar. The Cubs, they offered a 5-year deal worth $27.5 million with another $1.5 million in incentives. That contract was up there with Cal Ripken Jr., who signed the largest contract in MLB history in mid-August of 1992. At first, when the contract was first offered, Maddux did not accept it right away, but still wanted to return to Chicago. But due to Maddux not accepting Chicago's 5-year deal right away, the Cubs went on to sign pitcher Jose Guzman. An article I found from the Daily Herald, written by Barry Rosner, Maddux was in his car when he heard about the Guzman signing. He stopped at a payphone to call Larry Himes. Maddux then asked what it meant for him, and Maddux recalled that Himes said, "We're out of money, we can't sign you." What ended up happening, Greg Maddux signed with the Atlanta Braves for 5 years, $28 million. Now, what I want to mention is that the Cubs were owned by the Tribune Company. They were seen by Cubs fans as being cheap. Also, the Tribune Company had this perception of not wanting to spend money, as they'll have great profits with the attendance, no matter how bad the team is, and with the Cubs brand. So they're thinking, why spend money and be serious about competing? And lastly, there's also this perception that the Tribune Company really ran the Cubs like a business. So Maddux and Dawson, gone. As for the 93 Chicago Cubs, the season started strangely because on opening day, Greg Maddux, he returned to Wrigley with Atlanta, and the Braves won 1-0. But for the Chicago Cubs, Sammy Sosa had his first 30 home run season, and I also additionally like to mention that catcher Rick Wilkins, he had a surprisingly great season, hitting 30 home runs and batting .303. The Cubs, they did finish above 500 at 84-78 for the 93 season, 13 games behind the first place Phillies. This would be only the Cubs' third winning season since 1972. But despite that, GM Larry Himes fired manager Jim Lefevre. But next year would be a new expanded playoff format with 3 division winners and a wild card for each league. So enter the 1994 MLB season. Tom Troublehorn, who was a bench coach under Lefevre, would be promoted to be manager. So 1994 started with a bang as Carl Tuffy Rhodes opened the season hitting 3 home runs off of Doc Gooden. But the Cubs lost to the Mets as the season went on to become a terrible year for the Cubs. After a 9th consecutive home loss during the season, manager Tom Troublehorn, he kept a promise that he would answer any questions from the fans, so the Cubs skipper stood outside of Wrigley Field talking to an angry mob of Cubs supporters. In 1994, the Cubs wound up finishing last in their division. But also in 1994, specifically on June 13, Ryne Sandberg made a surprising announcement as the Cubs great announced his retirement. Then in August, the rest of the MLB season was canceled due to a strike. And I just want to mention that back then, my friends and I, we joked that there was a strike because Ryne Sandberg was making too much money, which obviously wasn't true. Now Sandberg, he had a terrible 94 season and was the second highest paid player behind Bobby Bonilla that season, according to the Baseball Cube. Now Sandberg, he wanted to play in 1995, but would return to play 2 more seasons in 1996 and 1997, and then call it quits for good. Moreover, Cubs manager Tom Troublehorn and GM Larry Himes would not return. So with a new manager and GM and an expanded playoff format, will the Cubs be able to get back to the postseason? Enter the 1995 MLB season. Jim Riggleman would be the new manager. Riggleman was a Padres manager for the previous 2 full seasons as San Diego did not get above 500. Ed Lynch, he'd be the new GM coming over from the Mets front office. So I'm showing you the rosters from 1995 to 1997 seasons, as there wasn't a lot of player turnover. And with these players, the Cubs, they would decline record-wise as they went from a .507 winning percentage during the shortened 95 season to under 500 the next 2 seasons. Some notes on some players. Sammy Sosa hit 36, then 40, then 36 home runs for those next 3 years with a lot of strikeouts, but also hilariously makes some crazy throws from the outfield, missing the cutoff man. At left field, yes, that is the same Luis Gonzalez, who would have some incredible offensive numbers later on in his career with Arizona, but wouldn't have close to those numbers in Chicago, but had a solid on-base percentage. Now during this time, there was such a revolving door at third baseman as the Cubs never seemed to get that position right, perhaps since the days of Ron Santo. Then a quick note with the pitchers, Jamie Navarro was with the Cubs for 2 seasons, where he had 1 really good year and 1 very solid year. And after his 2nd season, he then left the Cubs and signed with the White Sox and wound up being one of the worst free agent signings in Sox history. Meanwhile, Kevin Tapney was all right for the White Sox, but then was signed by the Cubs, and he was very good in his 13 starts in 1997, and then in 1998, Tapney, he won 19 games. closer Mel Rojas was a big signing for the Cubs for the 1997 season, but he wound up only converting 13 saves in 19 opportunities. Now, the most memorable moment during this time period happened in 1995, very late in the season, in late September, with the Cubs still having a chance to get the wildcard spot. Now, in a game tied up against Houston, Cubs reliever Randy Myers, he gave up a 2-run homer in the 8th, which prompted a fan to come out of the stands to confront Myers on the field. But the former nasty boy knocked down the fan with his forearm. And then I also want to talk about the 97 season, as the Cubs began the season with a brutal schedule, mainly playing Atlanta and Florida, as the Cubs began the 1997 with an 0-14 record, which was a National League record for a team beginning a season with the most consecutive losses. There was jokes going around at school that went like this: knock knock, who was there? Owen who? 0-9, and then 0-10 and 0-11, and so forth. So enough of that, because it's time to get to 1998, which was an insane year to be a Cubs fan. 1998 was one of the most memorable seasons a fan could ask for. The 1998 MLB season, it began with some sad news, as Cubs broadcasting legend Harry Carey passed away. For numerous people, there wasn't a more known name in terms of broadcasting baseball than Harry Carey. So the Cubs would wear a Harry Carey patch on their sleeves for the 1998 season. As for the roster, there was a lot of turnover. So you still had Scott Service at catcher, Mark Grace at first, and Sammy Sosa playing right field. At second was Mickey Morandini, who was such a typical number 2 hitter in the lineup. He was acquired from Philly after the Cubs traded Doug Glanville. Then at shortstop was Jeff Blauser, who signed as a free agent. And Blauser, he was a name you saw frequently in the postseason with Atlanta, but struggled with the Cubs. Perhaps some fans saw the Blauser signing as like window dressing to make it look like the Cubs were trying to win. At third base, I'll talk about this position more later on, but highly touted prospect Kevin Ory, he would begin the 98 season playing the hot corner. Ory, he struggled, and prior to the 98 trade deadline, he'd be dealt to Florida for essentially reliever Felix Heredia. Now I also want to talk about Jose Hernandez, or Harry Carey, you pronounce his name, Jose Hernandez. Now Hernandez, he had some power and is very versatile, as he could play every position in the infield and in the outfield. Hernandez wound up being the starting shortstop in September for the 98 season. In left field, the Cubs acquired in a trade a power-hitting left-hander who could get on base with Montreal in Henry Rodriguez. And then at center field was Lance Johnson, who would not draw a lot of walks, but he could hit around 300 and get a ton of triples and play excellent defense in center field. He was acquired in a trade with the Mets, and part of that trade included the Cubs sending Mel Rojas to New York. Then a look at the pitchers. Name I will mention is Rod Beck, who was signed as a free agent, was one of the better closers in baseball with the Giants. More on Shooter later on. So the 1998 Chicago Cubs, they began the season going 6-1. They would then be around that 500 mark in early May, and at this time there wasn't a lot of talk yet about Sammy Sosa. Then for a game on May 6 against a tough Houston Astros lineup, rookie pitcher Kerry Wood struck out 20 Astros in a very memorable and dominating performance. The Cubs won 2-0. The only hit given up by Wood was an infield single, but perhaps it could have been scored in air. But nonetheless, the baseball world was buzzing about Kerry Wood, and from what I remember, and from this game on, Wood, he was setting MLB records for most strikeouts in a 2-game span, then a 3-game span, and so forth. Then in the month of June, Sammy Sosa, who hit 9 home runs through his first 49 games, which is roughly a 30 home run pace for a season. But then from May 25 through June 30th, Sosa, he hit 24 home runs. Furthermore, Sosa, he hit an MLB record for home runs in a month when he blasted 20 bombs in the month of June. Now, I don't exactly remember when the talk really began with Sosa and McGwire breaking Roger Maris's single-season home run record of 61, but I'm thinking it may have been sometime in July. But anyways, you all know about Mark McGwire, who broke Roger Maris's record with 70 home runs in 1998, as Sosa hit 66. The home run chase was credited with saving baseball. Now, I don't want to get too much into it, as there are so many items about this chase, as I want to get back to what else happened to the Cubs in 1998. So in late July, the Cubs, they found themselves 2.5 games behind the division leader, the Houston Astros, with the trade deadline looming. The big name on the market was pitcher Randy Johnson, and the Cubs were rumored to be interested in the big unit. However, Randy Johnson wound up being traded to Houston, as Seattle, they got a nice prospect package in return. From this point on, Houston would basically run away with the division, but the Cubs, they were still in the wild card hunt. I remember a Cubs fan calling into a sports radio station disgusted that the Cubs did not acquire Randy Johnson. And I'm very much paraphrasing this, but the caller basically said, "Typical Cubs, not wanting to win. It's so frustrating. seeing the Cubs play the Astros with Houston having Randy Johnson on the mound while the Cubs have to go with Don Wingert. Now the Cubs, they did make a couple of acquisitions worth noting. They did sign veteran third baseman Gary Gaetti, who was released by the Cardinals to make room for Fernando Tatis. And Gaetti, he was terrific for the Cubs at third base. And then they also traded for reliever Matt Karchner, who was basically sharing closer duties with his ERA above 5 with the White Sox. But what the Cubs gave up to get Karchner was baffling, as they traded away John Garland, who was a first-round pick out of high school in 1997, to acquire a statistically below-average reliever. So I mentioned previously that Harry Carey passed away in February. Then in August, Jack Brookhouse, who was the Cubs play-by-play announcer before Harry Carey, passed away in August of 1998. The Cubs, they would wear a patch with the legendary Cubs broadcaster's catchphrase, "Hey, hey." So in September, the Cubs, they were in the wild card race, and at this point, every Cubs game seemed to be filled with tension because whenever Rod Beck would come in for the save, it seemed like the Cubs closer always allowed a runner or two on base each time out, but for the most part, he got the job done. But anyways, with 4 games left to go, of course every game is important. The Cubs, they were tied with the Mets for the only wild card berth, with San Francisco being 2.5 games back. The Cubs, they had a game left at Milwaukee and 3 left at Houston. So in that game against Milwaukee, Cubs up by 2 runs in the bottom of the 9th. Milwaukee, they had the bases loaded with 2 outs. Rod Beck was able to get Brewers hitter Jeff Jenkins to hit a catchable fly ball to left field, but Cubs outfielder Brant Brown dropped the ball, allowing 3 runners to score, thus the Brewers had a walk-off win. All the items with the Cubs being cursed really came to light, and confidence in the Cubs making the postseason really dwindled. Enter the final day of the 1998 MLB season. Here are the standings for the lone wildcard spot. Any ties would result in a 1-game playoff. What happened? The Cubs lost and the Mets lost. Thus, if San Francisco won, the Giants would be in the postseason, eliminating the Cubs. So the Northsiders, they would have to wait for the conclusion of the Giants-Rockies game in Colorado to determine the Cubs' postseason fate. And it didn't look promising. San Francisco got out to a 7-0 lead, but Colorado came back and wound up being 8-8 in the bottom of the 9th. Rockies infielder Nefi Perez, not known for his power, hit a walk-off home run. As a result, the Cubs and Giants would face off in a 1-game playoff at Wrigley Field. And what transpired? The Cubs would go on to win that game 5-3, and the Chicago Cubs, it'd be their first postseason appearance since 1989. And what's memorable thereafter was seeing Brant Brown celebrating like crazy. So heading into the postseason, the National League's 3 division winners were tough, well-rounded teams with very few weaknesses in Atlanta, Houston, and San Diego. The Cubs would only have to defeat 2 of those clubs to get to their first World Series since 1945, and then in the World Series face the New York Yankees, who at the time set an American League record with 114 wins. However, the extremely entertaining 1998 Chicago Cubs season ended quickly in the playoffs as the Braves swept the Cubs and the NLDS. The 1998 Chicago Cubs had quite the season. It was a wild season. That excitement from 1998 was hoping to carry on to the next season. However, things would be much different for the 1999 Chicago Cubs. So for the 1999 Chicago Cubs and their fans, the first piece of unfortunate news had to do with Kerry Wood, who would miss the entire 99 season and have Tommy John surgery. But as for the rest of the team, the Cubs would basically have the same team from the previous season, and all started out well. Around mid-June, the team was 32-24, a couple of games out of first place, and coming into Wrigley Field would be the Chicago White Sox. The White Sox, on the other hand, were 27-29 and already 10 games out of first place. So everything is seemingly going well for the Cubs. As for the youthful White Sox, this series you could perhaps say was kind of like their World Series, and I say that because White Sox manager Jerry Manuel would later say that he prepared for the series beforehand and set up his pitching staff with his best pitchers to go against the Cubs. As a result, the White Sox, they swept the Cubs at Wrigley. Now in reality, I don't think you can exactly point to something as being a turning point, but the Sox, they took this series seriously, and after the sweep, it honestly went downhill so quickly for the Cubs. After the series with the White Sox, the Cubs, they went 7-17, and during that span, what I remember most was that there was a stretch where the Cubs within a 5-game span lost by the scores of 17-6, 19-12, 14-1, and 21-8. That stretch had to be brutal to watch for a Cubs fan. Now Sosa, he had another huge power season, smashing 63 home runs, but the 1999 Chicago Cubs, they finished last in their division with a 67-95 record. Although 1999 was a tough season for Chicago Cubs fans, Kerry Wood, he would come back, and Chicago would have one of the top farm systems in the early 2000s, as more excitement and craziness would come back. Thank you so much for your interest in this video. There's so much to talk about in regards to the Cubs of the 90s. If you have anything like to mention about this period in Cubs history, go ahead and make a comment. I look forward to reading it. If you're interested in supporting the channel, there's a Patreon link below. Thank you so much. The Chicago Cubs in the 90s.